BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Sound of Gaming, the monthly show from BBC Radio 3, which opens up the incredible world of gaming music. I'm Louise Blaine, and every month I'll be featuring some of the very best gaming scores, offering insights into how the music works with the gameplay, talking to composers about how they set about creating their scores. I've classic tracks, I've also got the latest new releases. Subscribe to Sound of Gaming on BBC Sounds.
Hi, I'm Tom Service. Now, the answer to the question of why you need to know more about classical music, well, it's right here. This is the Listening Service podcast.
For me, the Czech composer Leos Janáček said, "A chord is a being come alive, a blood-stained flower of the musical art. I know when I write it that pain grips my heart, that the heart moans, wails, falls hard on the ground, is fragmented by the mist, hardens into granite." What do I care for the borrowed attributes, beautiful or ugly? In a flash of life, the chord's essence corresponds to my being. Janáček's music is the sound of a fearless loving of life. And never more so in the music that he wrote when he was in his 60s and 70s, which takes him and all of us listening to the edges of what it means to live and to love, and to lose and to suffer. We'll hear from our witnesses today, the impassioned Janáček lover, Nigel Simeone.
It's this combination of fabulously rich harmonic language, incredibly imaginative use of the orchestra, sometimes a little mad, but it's utterly distinctive. And this overwhelming feeling of wanting to sort of engulf you in a particular emotional world. It's extraordinary the way he manages to play with our emotions.
And from the relate counsellor Simon Bos, because Janáček's last years of ecstatic creativity in the 1920s were inspired by his infatuation with a married woman who was 37 years younger than him, Kamila Stoslova.
The man can have a fantasy of, I can access that youth that I so crave. But I'm not sure I've really come across many men who get that quite obsessive about one woman of a younger age. I think he was quite unusual in that sense, probably quite a romantic fantasist in a lot of ways.
An infatuation that Janáček turned into creative fuel for his music. But at what human cost? You know, listening to Janáček is a weird experience because his music moves from one idea to the next without any preparation at all. The individual ideas themselves are repetitive and self-generating and in their own terms predictable. Like the circling, cycling patterns in the Sinfonietta completed in 1926 when Janáček was 72. Repeating over and over. You never know when the next idea is going to smash into your ears. The logic that makes it work is the opposite of the compositional ideas and forms that other European music of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was so obsessed by. There's no system that can explain where Janáček's notes come from. or how his ideas are laid next to one another, in the way that you can with Schoenberg and Berg and Webern in the 1920s. And neither is there any overarching pre-made form, like a symphony or a sonata, that Janacek's music of his last decade is using. And yet there is, when we're listening to it, a deep sense of connection and urgency. Janacek was once asked which composer had influenced him the most. His reply? None. Can that really be true? Not even his fellow Czechs, Smetana or Dvorak, whom he knew and loved until Dvorak's death in 1904. Not Tchaikovsky, whose unfettered directness and fearlessness Janacek adored. And not Beethoven or Mozart. Well, the last two definitely not, actually, because Janacek saw routine in Beethoven and archaic artificiality in Mozart, and he wasn't afraid of calling out either. But no composers influenced him? Nigel Simeone tends to disagree with you, Leos. By the way, Tchaikovsky and Russian music really was an influence on you, he says.
He didn't just suddenly land from Mars, even though it does occasionally sound that way. Of course, he was a very serious, traditionally trained musician, and he was a passionate Russophile, and the music of Tchaikovsky, particularly among the Russians, was something that thrilled him throughout his life, and he certainly drew on it, though in a way that's filtered through many levels of Janacekness, but nonetheless it's there. And that sort of abrupt, explosive quality is something that you do find in Tchaikovsky. You find it in The Queen of Spades, you find it in Eugene Onegin.
Because it's a sort of distillation of repetition, blocks of material next to one another of wildly different emotional temperatures and musical temperatures. It's like a super distilled version of some of those techniques from Tchaikovsky, Rimsky maybe as well, but those Russian composers.
Well, Rimsky's very interesting because, of course, Janacek was fascinated by odd scales and unusual harmonies, as was Rimsky, and certainly there is, if not an influence there, certainly a shared interest, because with Janacek, one of the strange things you get is this resonance in the sound that's like no one else. The kind of voicing of these chords has a fabulous kind of glow. Clearly he got it from somewhere, and I think, Rimsky and Tchaik are both likely sources.
Nigel Simeone, and more from him later. Well, whatever the truth, even if Janacek himself doesn't want to admit any influence, there are nonetheless deep roots in Janacek's world of musical life forms and fierce and tender natural forces. So let's explore three of the bigger inspirations than composers for Janacek: community, speech melody, and love. Community first, because before his seemingly instant explosion into a life of fame as a composer, nationally and internationally, after 1904, when he was 50 and the premiere of his opera Jennifer, Janacek was a musician who made musical communities. That was his job. He was a teacher. In fact, he only stopped teaching in 1925 when he was over 70. He was a founder of orchestras, a conductor of choirs, and a proselytizer of the patriotic necessity of making Czech language theatre and opera in Brno, the Moravian town that Janacek dreamt would become part of an independent Czechoslovakia, which he did in 1918, coinciding with the final decade of his creativity. And that's an urgency of participatory, real-world musical and political action that you can hear in music like this. It's a setting of a poem by Petr Bezruč called the 70,000, and it's music of tragic Czech nationalism, this as an army ponders its own slaughter in the face of a much larger enemy. Janacek makes it a distilled dramatic cantata of communal terror and transfiguration. He writes for solo voices who appear among the lamenting textures of the choir and who cry above them in a frightening falsetto. And Janacek composed the 70,000 for the Moravian Teachers' Male Chorus in 1909, whose amateur descendants in the very same choir are singing on this recording in 1996. But Janacek's interests go even more deeply local than those communities of choirs and audiences in Brno, thanks to his transcribing of speech melodies. Now, speech melodies are simply the melodic shapes that our voices make all the time when we're speaking. Every time we say anything at all, our voices move up and down, quieter and louder. And for Janacek, the melodies of our speech reveal our deepest feelings. For me, he said, music as it comes out of the instruments from the repertoire, whether it's by Beethoven or anyone else, has little truth in it. Isn't that astounding? Whereas whenever somebody spoke to me, I grasped the rise and fall of the notes. At once I knew what the person was like. I know how he or she felt, whether he or she was lying, whether he or she was upset. Sounds, the intonation of human speech, indeed of every living being, have for me the deepest truth. Which ought to mean that when Janacek composes for voices, in his choruses and above all in his operas, all he would need to do was transpose his speech melodies into the mouths of his characters, like the tragic Katja Kabanova, the pooterish Mr. Bruchek, or the 3 centuries-old Elena Makropoulos. Well, it's not that simple. Nigel Simeone is an answer to how Janacek's love of speech melodies are both part of, but not the whole story.
Certainly these rather abrupt little patterns that he noted down in the vegetable market in Brno or wherever were things that certainly made it into the very kind of brusque quality that you find in a lot of his music, actually. But I think we need to guard against an absolutely direct connection because, as he himself said, speech is spoken, so it doesn't instantly transform itself into music. That's a much more complicated process and is, in Janacek's case, very much mediated through his deep understanding of Moravian folk music, which was tremendously important. The scales and modes of folk music are pervasive in his own music.
It may be such an appealing idea because it feels like it almost relates to how we hear his music, the impact it makes, Nigel, its directness, as you say, brusqueness. It's like somebody uttering something, of course, made with deep poetry and all that kind of thing, but we feel its absolute vividness, as if somebody is telling you something and then telling you something completely different and then having a complete, it seems to relate to the experience of Janacek's music.
I think that's a lovely point, but in a sense that's more impressionistic than actual, because what makes his music so, visceral, I think I would say, is often obsessive repetition. And more than that, it's this glorious combination of repeating patterns with each other. So Janacek at his most sort of Janacek-y, if you will, the overture to the Makropoulos affair, which is a kind of complete festival of mad ostinatos combining with each other. The crazy da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da at the start. And then the ba-da-da-da-da-dum from the offstage trumpet. and then them all being combined. And this is the most incredibly exhilarating music imaginable.
How can he employ this same brusqueness, repetition, when he's writing lyrical lines or his operatic parts, those long scenes in Katya or Yennefer or whatever it might be? How does he translate all that to when he's actually writing for these voices?
Well, here we do get to something that is a little bit closer to speech rhythm, insofar as the line is usually carried through the orchestra, actually, while the voices often have quite fragmentary bits and pieces to sing. So in something like the final scene of Katya, where she loses her mind, all of the continuous musical argument is in the orchestra, while she is kind of muttering increasingly sort of incoherently. And what's fabulous in an opera like Katya is those very few moments where the singers do simply sing sort of almost Puccini-like melodic lines. Those moments are quite rare of an actual sort of tune, and they're all the more moving and exhilarating for that.
Nigel Simeone. But you know, if we could speak to Janacek, he would have a much simpler answer as to where many of these characters and where the fierce directness of his music comes from. Love. In his relationship with Kamila Stoslova, who was in his life from 1917 until the day he died in August 1928. Because those pieces and characters that Nigel has just mentioned have some relationship to Kamila, who was 37 years younger than him. She was married to someone else, as he was too. Zdenka Janacek had already put up with an affair earlier in their marriage, and she'd attempted to commit suicide. But Janacek described how Katya Kabanova was made for Kamila, how Emilia Marti, in the Macropolis case, contained Camilla's ice coolness. But the piece in which this bizarre relationship was truly consecrated isn't an opera or even a work of vocal music, but a string quartet, his second, which Janacek originally wanted to call Love Letters, so that everyone will understand, he said, what the piece was about. And those earlier Kamila-inspired operas and other pieces were written in hot ash, but the quartet, the last major piece from the last year of his life, 1928, was composed, he said, in fire. Janacek wrote to Kamila throughout the quartet's composition. And remember, this is a 73-year-old composer reflecting on 10 years of fantasizing about being with a now 36-year-old woman. Well, the opening movement was about the instant alchemy that he felt when they met. He said, the second movement flares up in the Luhaczowitzer heat, the spa where the couple shared their first kiss, the probable limit of their physical relationship, where Janacek indulged the fantasy too that they were husband and wife. The third movement discloses Janacek's dream of the suspicion of Camilla's motherhood, his imagination of the son that they might have had together, and the music, he said, sounds just like you are, turning from tears to laughter. And the last movement of the quartet was When the Earth Trembled, a place in which Janacek allowed himself and his music to do what he could not in real life. But just listen to this music. I mean, it does not sound like an erotic wish fulfillment fantasy. It's more like a possessed fever dream. The violence of these contrasts, its frenzy, its soaring lyricism. The ugly, beautiful textures, these strings digging into the guts of their instruments. Wild, disfigured dances. It's music that burns with as much frustration and mania as it does with transcendent joy. The earth moving, more like the ground opening up, making the lovers fall into the abyss of an earthquake. Janacek knew that bringing these love letters into the world would come at a cost. He compromised on the title in the end, calling it Intimate Letters, deciding that some secrets, after all, didn't deserve to be known by the whole world. But what is this music really revealing? Because in these 700 or so letters that Janacek wrote to Camilla, it's clear that this wasn't a real relationship at all. What's going on then inside this one-sided non-relationship? Simone Bose is a counsellor at the relationship advice centre Relate, and she put Leos Janacek and Camilla Stuslova on her imaginary couch.
You've got to actually understand what they're doing there, so that would be a first thing. They'd be like, we want to try and make this relationship work. Where did things go wrong? And then I would probably start looking at like where things did go wrong. What are they not getting in the relationship that's happening here? Or is it just that he wants to recapture his youth in some way and he's obsessed with that idea and he can't stop himself? It's like an addiction. Then I would say, well, that might be the end of the relationship then. If he cannot actually part from that and she's not very happy, I would say probably it's not very good that you two are together.
There is so much that they'd been through, his previous affair, the death of their daughter. Obviously, a lot of that deeply traumatic, but potentially also bonding, potentially. And we know that part of the infatuation is the infatuation with that Camilla represents not only herself, but a life of total freedom, that he can be in nature, in communion with his muse, as opposed to trapped in this marriage in his house with Zhidenka.
There's no outpouring to his wife, is there? Nothing at all. So that would be a good start for him to actually get better at talking to his wife, about these things. He shouldn't be talking about this outside. He should start getting better at communicating with her.
This may not be something you've had direct experience of, but you may have observed the egomania of the creative artist, and perhaps especially the male creative artist. I wonder if there are patterns you might be able to talk to there about the egomania of the male artist, and perhaps especially the male artist who either thinks of themselves as a quote-unquote great artist or who the world calls a great artist.
I think that it would be important to talk about this in terms of the relationship. I'd say how much of the relationship does actually revolve around your needs over your wife's needs. Do you listen to the needs of your wife? Are you listening to each other? Are you hearing each other? Or do things tend to revolve around you? Which I'm assuming it probably did, didn't it? The importance was around him. And I would encourage him to think more about his wife, you know, as a person, as a person with emotions and feelings and needs as well. It's not just him that has needs, but he might not be able to see that. He may be too blinded. I'd love to see what he'd be like in a counselling room, actually. Would he be willing to hear his wife?
Simon Bose. But maybe Janacek knew all along what he was doing, because he was protected by the impossibility of actually being with Camilla. So he never had to face the reality of making a life with her. But if Camilla the Muse was really a figment of Janacek's imagination, the power of the music he composed inspired by her is anything but imaginary. Music like this. This is the final scene of his opera The Macropolis Case, first heard in 1926. Emilia Marti has revealed herself as, in reality, the 337-year-old Elena Macropolis, who's been in search for the formula for the life-sustaining elixir that allowed her to reach past mortality. And having at last found it at the end of the opera, she realises that life's sweetness and meaning comes not from living forever, but from the certainty of death. And this music, about death, about the lack of joy in Elena's life, there is no joy in heaven, this dreadful loneliness, that's what she's singing, is paradoxically among the most radiant and most energising music that Janacek ever composed. And that's saying something. The very end of the opera is a defiant reclaiming of the present tense. A present tense that means Elena Macropolis' death. Yet this is music which is really about the most urgent celebration of life. Fleeting, joyful, tragic, fierce, earthy. Camilla Stuslova may have been an imaginary surrogate in Janacek's life for the even bigger love that he felt for life itself. "I am not afraid of living," he said just months before he died. "I like life an awful lot. To live. Life is beautiful." And all of this music, made for Camilla, becomes a gift of ferocious and fearless life for all of us who hear it. To listen to Janacek's music is to live brighter and sharper than you could ever have thought possible. Pain on pain, bliss on bliss, and love on love.
That was that edition of the Listening Service, and as the well of your knowledge about classical music is filled ever higher, you know there's a place you can go to find out even more. The entire back catalogue of this programme, all 120 plus episodes, are there for you, just waiting to be heard on BBC Sounds.